Welcome to this podcast on architectural acoustics. In this podcast, I will try to answer why we are interested in architectural acoustics in the first place and what aspects it influences in architecture. Acoustics is strongly related to the creation and the construct of atmosphere. And Peter Zumthor, the Swiss architect, writes that in his book on atmosphere, interiors are like large instruments, collecting sound, amplifying it, transmitting it elsewhere. That has to do with the shape peculiar to each room and with the surfaces of the materials they contain, and the way those materials have been applied. Zumthor refers in his book on atmospheres as one example to the Broad Street Station in Richmond that has a particular atmosphere, also down to its acoustics. In a project that he has designed himself, we here see the Swiss pavilion from the Hanover Expo in 2000, where the construction is made of wood and is configured from many singular elements to a composition and a whole. Here, musicians can place themselves in the space and by this configure how the sound is spread in the space. In the same way, the audience, the viewers, the occupants can move around and position themselves in relation to this composition of space and composition of sound. In this project, it is constructed as a large rectangle through the walls that we see here to the left. And the composition allows musicians to place themselves in very different spatial configurations that will influence the sound and the perception of the acoustics. All this created through the use of simple or relatively simple wood elements in a composition that allows scattering, transmission, and absorption of sound in different ways. The Finnish architectural theoretician Juhani Pallismaa writes on sensing that sight isolates where sound incorporates. Vision is directional where sound is the omnidirectional. The sense of sight implies exteriority, but sound creates an experience of interiority. I regard an object, but sound approaches me. The eye reaches, but the ear receives. So sound is tied to a very different way of sensing our surroundings to the other senses. Furthermore, Sten Eiler Rasmussen, the Danish architectural theorist, writes in 1964, "Can architecture be heard? Most people would probably say that architecture does not produce sound. It cannot be heard. But neither does it radiate light, and yet it can be seen. We see the light reflects and thereby gain an impression of form and material. In the same way, we hear the sounds it reflects, and they too give us an impression of form and material." So while we often consider light the most important part of the articulation of form, shape and material, acoustics has a strong presence in everything we do in architecture, and it can be configured by the geometries, the materials, the spatial compositions, and the occupancies and the sources of these spaces. This is a project I was part of doing in 2012. It was an acoustic pavilion in which we configured the space for classical music. It was a pavilion. We've developed a design method that changed the geometry, the local triangular geometries, the porosity of these elements, and the musicians could then position themselves in the space to configure their impact of the space and the sound perceived in this space. And when we talk about acoustics, we have a large set of vocabulary that we can use to understand and communicate the properties and phenomena of acoustics. This is something that acousticians and acoustical engineers use in a way to explain what acoustics is, how acoustics is perceived, and how we can go about designing it. So this is not an extensive list, but it shows some of the things that are of high relevance when discussing acoustics. One thing could be, is it a dead dry or dead room. That means it has a lack of reverberation time. Do we have echo in the space? Do we talk about an envelopment, which means that the sound, impression of the sound is arriving from all directions and surrounding the listener? This is typically very important in concert halls. Can we talk about intimacy, which is the sensation the music is being played in a small room? Basically, you have the sensation that the musician, the instrument, or the singer is very close to you, even if the person or instrument is far away. Reverberation time is a central term in acoustics, and so forth. So there is a very rich vocabulary for architectural acoustics, which can be utilized to understand and discuss the phenomena that we are interested in. But not only does it create atmosphere, it also has direct impact on our health. When we look to hospitals, it is said from the literature that noise levels in hospitals and healthcare have doubled since 1992, and that noise distraction substantially increased dispensing areas. Furthermore, the body responds to noise in the same way it responds to stress, and over time can impair health. This means that one thing that acoustics does is, of course, the construction of atmosphere, but it also has a direct impact on our health and how we operate in noisy environments. For this reason also, the World Health Organization, the WHO, has put recommended limits, noise limits, for instance in hospitals. The problem is here we can see that the limits that they have put out is around 35 dB to 30 dB. Unfortunately, the condition is much more often 70 dB. This gives problems, as we saw in the other slide, with recovery and creating comfortable atmospheres and environments for humans. We have similar effects in educational contexts. Here is said that external noise was found to have a significant negative impact upon performance. This is targeted at the students. They simply learn in a worse way, so to say, than if the noise and acoustics were better. This has, however, also consequences. The results provide evidence for an association between noise exposure and vocal load and development of vocal symptoms and cognitive fatigue after work. This is targeted, or this is to do with the teachers in educational contexts. So in summary, why are we interested in architectural acoustics? Well, acoustics are central aspects in understanding a space. Acoustics are central aspects in determining the atmosphere of a space. Acoustics are based on omnidirectional sensing experienced by reception. And acoustics have direct impact on human health, which includes patient, staff, and others in any given context. And acoustics have direct impact on learning conditions, students and teachers. So I hope this small podcast gave an introduction to why we should increasingly focus on architectural acoustics and when we design spaces in architecture. Thank you for watching.